Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are diving into a fascinating roadmap that challenges, well, basically everything modern hustle culture teaches about wealth.
Oh, absolutely. It completely flips the script.
Right. We're unpacking a source titled 10 Biblical Money Lessons I Wish I Learned 40 Years Ago. And whether you're an entrepreneur, someone trying to get out of debt, or just curious about ancient wisdom applied to modern economics, this source argues that building wealth without a higher purpose is like building a mansion on sand.
Yeah, it's a structural issue.
Exactly. We'll explore why character is capital, why giving first might be the ultimate growth strategy, and how ancient texts actually predicted modern portfolio theory. Our goal here is to systematically unpack these 10 principles to understand how the source bridges spiritual faith with highly practical financial action.
It's a massive topic, for sure.
It really is. And hey, before we get too far into this, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. All right, so let's jump in. Where do we even start with this?
Well, I think we need to set the stage first. Just as an impartiality note for you listening, while the source material is deeply rooted in biblical scripture, we are analyzing its economic and philosophical frameworks objectively.
Right, we're not taking sides on the theology itself.
Exactly. We're exploring its arguments to see how a theistic worldview, the belief that God is actively involved, completely changes how a person handles capital. We're comparing that to, say, secular or atheistic perspectives where just accumulating money is the final goal.
And that's a huge distinction because, before looking at how to make money, we have to look at the mindset this source says is required to even sustain it, right?
Right.
The first lesson they talk about is God's blueprint, the idea that prosperity isn't about accumulation, it's about alignment. They use Proverbs 3, talking about honoring the Lord with wealth.
Yeah, the phrase they use is purpose before profit, which is, very different from the usual secure the bag first, find your purpose later mentality.
Totally. They bring up Nehemiah rebuilding the city wall. Like he didn't just start stacking bricks randomly.
No, he had a deeply defined purpose first. He planned it out, and then the resources followed that specific plan.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because it was right into lesson 2, which is stewardship. The text references Psalm 24 to argue that wealth is entrusted to you, not owned by you.
Which is a massive psychological shift.
It is. It's like, think about the difference between renting a house and owning it. Or, actually, no, think about managing an Airbnb for an owner versus owning the house yourself. When you believe you're just managing someone else's ultimate property, in this case, God's wealth, your behavior shifts.
It shifts away from reckless consumption.
Exactly. You become a careful steward because you have a fiduciary duty.
What's fascinating here is how this shifts the psychological burden of wealth. If we look at this through like a modern lens, an atheistic worldview often ties your net worth directly to your self-worth.
Oh yeah, if your startup fails, you fail as a person.
Right. It's an existential crisis.
Yeah.
But if money is just a tool for influence, if it's someone else's resources you're managing, it removes the ego from financial tracking. You aren't budgeting because you're greedy. You're budgeting because you're a manager.
It's just logistics.
Exactly. It's logistics, not identity.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And there's this wild example they use from John 6, the story where Jesus feeds the 5,000.
Oh, right. The loaves and fishes.
Yeah. So he miraculously creates this massive abundance of food, but then right after, he tells his disciples to gather all the leftovers so that nothing may be lost.
Which is so counterintuitive.
Right. Like you just conjured infinite food out of thin air. Why do you care about some crusts of bread?
Yeah.
But the source uses this as a core principle of resource management. Even in miraculous abundance, waste is still a massive failure of stewardship.
It's about respecting the resource. If you treat small amounts with intense care, you build the operational habits needed for massive scale.
Okay, but wait, I have to push back here for a second.
Sure, go for it.
If I'm managing someone else's money, my natural instinct is to be ultra conservative. Like I want to hide it under a mattress or put it in a low-yield savings account so I literally cannot lose it. Isn't taking business risks completely contrary to being a faithful protector of that wealth?
You would think so, but the source argues the exact opposite. It says true stewardship actually demands courageous multiplication.
Really? How so?
Well, it points to lesson 3, drawing from the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. You remember the servant who hid his talent in the ground?
Yeah, the master gets furious with him.
Exactly. He lost it not because he made a bad investment, but because of fear. Stagnation is penalized. The source quotes James 2 saying, "Faith without works is dead. An unused resource is a wasted one."
So it's advocating for risk.
Yes, but, and this is crucial, it advocates for spirit-led risks, not reckless gambling. It brings in Proverbs 15, which is all about seeking counsel.
Oh, so mitigating risk through wisdom and advisors.
Right, calculated initiative. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Lesson 4 talks about righteous foundations. Proverbs 10 says, whoever walks in integrity walks securely.
Right. The Old Testament was obsessed with condemning dishonest scales, like merchants rigging the weights to cheat people.
Yeah, and today a dishonest scale is, what, a hidden subscription fee?
Oh, absolutely. Or like those dark UI patterns on websites that trick you into adding things to your cart.
Exactly. Righteousness in this context means fair pricing, treating your customers well, and paying fair wages, which they reference in Colossians 4.
So the argument is that character is literally capital.
Yes. In the American market, or really any market, transparent practices create a level of brand loyalty and public trust that no marketing budget can buy. Shady practices might pump up your quarterly earnings, but they're mathematically unstable long-term.
Ethical business is the ultimate retention strategy.
Precisely.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. Once you have this ethical foundation, the text introduces a concept that completely flips traditional secular financial advice upside down.
You're talking about the giving aspect.
Yeah. Lesson 5, give first. The hustle culture playbook says you hoard your capital, you scale your business, you get your private jet, and then maybe, from your excess, you give a little to charity.
Right, the self-centered model.
But this source uses Proverbs 11, a generous person will prosper, and Malachi 3, challenging believers to test God's provision. It says you have to give capital away before you've made it big. That just sounds crazy from a standard economic standpoint.
From a purely mathematical, atheistic standpoint, it does seem irrational. Yeah. Why give away your compounding power early on?
Exactly.
But psychologically, giving first breaks the grip of greed. The source references Luke 12 about guarding against greed. It forces you to view transactions not as a zero-sum game where you have to crush the other guy, but as a way to advance a bigger kingdom or purpose.
It's an enforced discipline of detachment.
Right. It physically acts out the belief that you are a steward, not an owner.
Which is incredibly freeing. And speaking of being free, Lesson 6 goes hard on avoiding enslaving debt. Like Proverbs 22, the borrower is slave to the lender.
The word slave there is a very deliberate economic reality.
Oh, for sure. Now, the source does distinguish between leveraging debt for an appreciating asset, like maybe a solid real estate deal, versus toxic consumption debt, like financing a lifestyle just to look rich on Instagram.
Right, maintaining a false image.
Yeah, and it recommends getting out of that toxic debt using the debt snowball or debt avalanche method.
Both of which are very practical.
Let's actually define those for a second. So the debt avalanche is mathematically optimal, right? You list your debts and you attack the one with the highest interest rate first.
Yes, to minimize the total cash you lose to the bank.
But the debt snowball says you attack the smallest balance first, ignoring the interest rate.
Because finance is behavioral. Getting that quick win, paying off that small credit card, it gives you a dopamine hit. It builds the momentum you need to stick with it. But the real reason the source is so anti-debt is about optionality.
What do you mean by optionality?
Well, if your future labor is already sold to a credit card company to pay for last year's vacation, you are financially paralyzed. You can't take those spirit-led risks we talked about.
Oh, yeah.
By prioritizing generosity and aggressively attacking debt, you become nimble. You're economically agile enough to pivot when a new opportunity comes up without being weighed down by lenders.
That makes a ton of sense. You can't be a good steward if your hands are completely tied by Visa and MasterCard.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say you've done this. You're free from bad debt. You're giving generously. How does the source suggest you actually grow the portfolio?
Well, that brings us to Lesson 7. Invest with wisdom. Proverbs 21 warns that haste leads to poverty.
Haste, meaning like FOMO, fear of missing out.
Exactly. Investing requires serious discernment. Just because a stock is hyping on social media doesn't mean you jump in. The text brings up Ecclesiastes 3, reminding us that there are seasons in the market.
You can't force the harvest.
Right.
And speaking of Ecclesiastes, this is my favorite part of the whole source. Lesson 8 is diversify like Solomon. Ecclesiastes 11 says to invest in 7 or 8 ventures because you don't know what disaster might happen.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's incredible. King Solomon built wealth through trade routes, agriculture, gold, strategic alliances. He is basically outlining modern portfolio theory centuries before Wall Street was even a concept.
Yeah, he's saying that putting everything in one basket isn't just risky, it's practically arrogant.
Like you think you can predict the future perfectly.
Exactly. It's a lack of humility.
Yeah.
True diversification protects you from systemic shocks.
It's asset allocation 101, thousands of years ago. But then we hit this tension in lesson 9. The source praises diligence. Proverbs 12 says diligent hands will rule. But then it immediately pairs that with Exodus 20, which is the command to observe a Sabbath.
To literally stop working.
Right. How do you balance the intense hustle required to manage a diversified modern portfolio with a divine mandate to just stop?
This raises an important question, right? Because in a hyper-materialist worldview, if you aren't working, you're losing. But the source uses the tension of the farmer waiting for rain from James 5.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the farmer is diligent. He plows the field, plants the seed, pulls the weeds, but he cannot engineer the rain.
He just has to wait.
He has to trust. Taking a Sabbath, actually turning off your devices, stepping away for a full day, is the practical application of that trust. It prevents burnout. It reminds the entrepreneur that provision isn't solely generated by their endless hustle.
It's a physical declaration that the world won't end if you stop carrying it for 24 hours.
And practically, that rest restores your executive function and creativity.
So it's not just a nice spiritual idea, it's a competitive advantage.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean in the end? Because all this diligent work, the wise investing, the resting, it's not just to build a massive dragon's hoard of gold to sit on, right?
No, not at all. It builds to a final outward-looking climax.
Lesson 10, leave a legacy. Proverbs 13 says, a good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children.
But it's not just about transferring cash.
Right, the source is super clear on this. It's about passing on wisdom, faith, and resources. They use the example of the Apostle Paul mentoring Timothy.
Because passing down a massive portfolio to a kid who has no character or discipline...
Oh, it destroys them. It's like handing a teenager the keys to a Ferrari before they know how to drive.
Exactly. Money without guidance destroys. But money paired with discipleship multiplies.
So leaving a legacy transforms a regular business into a multi-generational vehicle for impact.
The source actually has a specific call to action here. It urges you to stop chasing temporary gains and declare, I trust God's timing for my success. It says financial breakthrough requires obedience, starting small, and staying consistent.
So, to sum it all up for you listening, these 10 lessons weave together to argue that this framework for handling money is radically different from the secular world's approach.
It really is night and day.
Yeah, it requires wisdom, purpose, and kingdom alignment to build the structure that no economic storm can destroy. We started with the mindset of stewardship, moved through courageous but righteous risk, radical generosity.
Escaping bad debt.
Yes. Diversifying like Solomon, resting like a farmer, and ultimately building a legacy that outlasts you.
And, looking at all of this objectively, the source ultimately redefines wealth completely. It's measured not by what you earn, but by what you leave behind and who you lift up along the way.
It's a beautiful way to look at it.
It is, and it leaves us with this final, lingering question to ponder.
Oh, let's hear it.
If every dollar you spent, invested, or gave away was a public vote on your deepest values, what story would your bank statement tell about the kind of world you're trying to build?
Wow. That is a heavy but deeply necessary question to ask ourselves. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope it gave you some incredible new perspectives to apply to your own life and finances. Keep thinking deeper, and we'll see you next time.